How can an airliner show about 1,800 kilograms of fuel remaining while both engines run out of fuel? Power. First, one engine stopped producing thrust. Then the other. The crew tried to restart them, but the engines would not come back. And yet, in the cockpit, the fuel indications still showed enough fuel to keep the aircraft flying. That should have been more than enough fuel to keep both engines running. So which reality was correct? The number on the instrument, or what the engines were telling them? On August 6, 2005, Tuninter Flight 1153 left Bari, Italy, bound for Jerba, Tunisia. It was an ATR 72 carrying passengers across the Mediterranean. At first, there was nothing about the flight that suggested what was coming. The aircraft climbed away normally. The crew had the information they expected. The engines were running. The flight was routine. Until one engine stopped producing power. There was no dramatic warning that immediately explained why. Just a sudden loss of thrust. The crew began working through the problem. An engine can lose power for many reasons. A mechanical failure, a fuel system problem, an interruption in fuel flow, something else entirely. And at first, there was no reason to believe the aircraft was running out of fuel. The cockpit fuel indication still showed a substantial amount remaining. Then the situation became much worse. The second engine also lost power. Now this was no longer an isolated engine problem. Both engines were no longer producing thrust. The crew attempted to restart them, but neither engine returned to normal operation. And that created a contradiction that would define the entire accident. The engines were behaving as though the tanks were empty. The instrument was behaving as though they weren't. The aircraft was now losing altitude over the Mediterranean. But the number in the cockpit still suggested that fuel remained. The crew had one problem they could see. They did not yet know whether the instrument was telling them the truth. With both engines losing power, the crew had to determine what kind of emergency they were actually facing. If the information said there was fuel, the logical response was to troubleshoot an engine problem. If the information said the tanks were empty, the priority was completely different. They needed to prepare for a forced landing. That distinction mattered, because the aircraft was still telling them that fuel existed. The crew attempted engine restarts. They worked through the procedures available to them. But the engines remained silent. The aircraft was now a glider, and the crew turned toward the nearest practical landing area, attempting to reach the coast near Palermo. There was no longer any question that they were in a serious emergency. The question was as what had caused it. The fuel indication still showed a large reserve, but neither engine was behaving as though that reserve existed. The contradiction followed them all the way down. The aircraft was descending. The engines were silent, and the reassuring number was still there. Then investigators began asking a question that would change the entire story. If the engines had actually stopped because of fuel starvation, where had all the fuel gone? That question eventually led investigators back to the number that had seemed so reassuring. About 1,800 kilograms. But the investigation did not begin with the cockpit display. It began with the physical evidence. The amount of fuel that had actually been available to the aircraft was reconstructed from the aircraft's fuel history, loading records, fuel consumption, and flight data. And the numbers told a very different story. At one point, the aircraft had approximately 790 kilograms of actual fuel. but the cockpit indication suggested approximately 3,050 kilograms. The difference was already enormous. The aircraft continued flying. The real fuel continued to disappear. The cockpit number did not. After another stage of the flight, the aircraft had only about 305 kilograms of actual fuel remaining. The indication still suggested roughly 2,300 kilograms. Then came the final flight. After taxiing, the aircraft had only about 540 kilograms of actual fuel available. But the cockpit indication suggested approximately 2,660 kilograms. The number was not simply inaccurate. It was creating an entirely different picture of the aircraft's fuel state. And then the engines began to flame out. The right engine lost power first. The crew attempted to restart it. Then the left engine also lost power. At the moment both engines had flamed out, the actual fuel remaining was 0. But the fuel quantity indicator still showed approximately 1,800 kilograms. 0. 1,800. The tanks were empty. The cockpit said they were not. And that was the moment the investigation could no longer treat the fuel indication as a minor error. Something was fundamentally wrong with the instrument itself. Investigators eventually discovered the reason. The fuel quantity indicator installed in the aircraft was not the correct unit for an ATR-72. It was an ATR-42 type indicator installed in an ATR-72. The two aircraft did not use the same fuel quantity calibration. So the indicator could receive the fuel level information from the ATR-72 and translate it incorrectly. It was not simply displaying a slightly wrong number. It was interpreting the aircraft's actual fuel level according to the wrong calibration. That explained the impossible number. With the ATR-72's tanks completely empty, the incorrect indicator could still show approximately 1,800 kilograms. The number from the opening mystery finally made sense. The aircraft had not mysteriously lost 1,800 kilograms of fuel. It had never had that amount available when the cockpit said it did. But solving the fuel mystery created a more important question. How did the wrong instrument get onto the aircraft in the first place? And how did it survive the system that was supposed to catch it? A critical component is not supposed to reach an aircraft by accident. There are procedures, records, checks, and people whose job is to prevent exactly that. But in this case, the chain had already broken. The fuel quantity indicator had been replaced during maintenance. The replacement unit was intended for an ATR-42. The aircraft receiving it was an ATR-72. The two indicators could physically be installed in a way that did not immediately make the mistake obvious. And that detail was crucial, because the component did not look obviously broken. It did not produce an immediate warning. It did not refuse to work. It worked. It simply worked according to the wrong calibration. That meant the aircraft could continue operating while presenting a completely misleading fuel quantity. And the problem was bigger than one number on one display. There was another safeguard. The ATR-72 had a low-level fuel warning system designed to alert the crew when fuel levels became dangerously low. Under normal circumstances, that warning could provide an important second indication that the aircraft was approaching fuel exhaustion. But the warning system depended on the same fuel quantity information that had already been corrupted. The wrong indication, therefore, did more than mislead the main fuel display. It compromised another layer of protection. The safeguard that should have told the crew the fuel is almost gone was no longer giving them the independent confirmation they needed. That changed the accident completely. It was no longer just a wrong component. It was becoming a chain. A component was identified incorrectly. The wrong component was installed. The indication became misleading. The aircraft's actual fuel quantity became dangerously low. The cockpit continued to show a large reserve. And the low-level warning that could have provided another clue was also compromised by the same faulty fuel quantity information. One false input had spread through the system. And that is what made the situation so dangerous. The aircraft did not simply lose fuel. The people flying it lost the ability to accurately know how much fuel was left. By now, the mystery seems simple. The aircraft ran out of fuel because the wrong fuel quantity indicator had been installed. But that explanation is too small. Because the accident was not caused by one isolated component behaving badly. It was a chain of failures. The aircraft had a fuel indicator that belonged to a different aircraft type. That indicator produced a believable but incorrect fuel quantity. The false indication contributed to an incorrect understanding of how much usable fuel was actually available. And because another warning depended on the same information, the aircraft's safety net was weakened at the same time. Look at the numbers again. 790 kilograms actual. 3,050 indicated. 305 actual. 2,300 indicated. 540 actual. 2,660 indicated. And when both engines finally stopped, 1,800 indicated. The real fuel quantity kept falling. The cockpit number remained reassuring. That is what made the failure so difficult to recognize. Nothing about the number looked impossible to the people flying the aircraft. It looked like fuel. It looked like a reserve. It looked like enough. Until the engines stopped. The pilots were not simply ignoring an obvious warning. They were making decisions using information that appeared trustworthy. And that is the deeper lesson of Flight 1153. A safety system is only as strong as the information it depends on. If the information is wrong, the decisions built on top of it can also be wrong. And if several systems depend on that same information, one mistake can move through the entire chain without being stopped. The aircraft did not suddenly lose 1,800 kilograms of fuel. The cockpit had been carrying a false picture of the fuel state long before the final engine flameout. By the time the truth became undeniable, the engines had already run out of fuel. The most dangerous part was not simply losing the fuel. It was losing the ability to know that it was gone. The pilots could see the fuel number. They could trust the instrument. They could make decisions based on it. But the number represented a reality that did not exist. The engines told the truth first. The instrument told a different story. And by the time the cockpit could no longer ignore the truth, there was almost nothing left to do. On Flight 1153, the cockpit's fuel number survived longer than the fuel itself.